Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's guest on the podcast is Dr. William Beer, PhD and CEO of Tunley Environmental. Tunley Environmental, home to trusted scientists, is at the forefront of sustainability consulting, guided by the vision to empower sustainable solutions and fueled by their means to accelerate sustainability globally. Tunley's dedicated team of exceptional PhD qualified scientists forms the backbone of the environmental team. We're going to talk to Dr. Beer about the idea behind Tunley Environmental, some of the projects he's working on, and how he sees that maritime in particular has in aiding in the reduction of carbon and other emissions globally. Dr. Beer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. Please just call me Will.
Like we were talking before, sometimes I deal with admirals and doctors, and sometimes I do still get nervous about making sure I call the person the right
Will's
title.
Great. Will is great. Thank you.
So Will, let's kick it off. Like, talk to us a little bit about your background and what you're doing today at Tunley.
Yeah, well, thank you. So my background is pretty unique, really. I mean, I grew up racing motorbikes, and for me, all things were mechanical. So I absolutely obsessed with how things work. That, fast tracked me into university, where I failed. I ended up resitting my degree, so I did it twice. I met the right woman, and suddenly got the best grades in the year as a result. And that then meant that when the crash of 2008 hit, I was offered a load of PhDs that were paid. So I chose one based on how quickly I got paid, because I'd blown my race bike up, and that led me on to the PhD. And my PhD was an environmental PhD, which really opened my eyes to what was going on around the world. It was to reduce the impact of certain activities. The doctorate really accelerated my career. I very quickly got into global engineering management, and I learned to transform an engineering department, reduce their lead times, and ultimately that gave me the courage and the resilience to start working on my own company. And Tunley came out of that. And now our entire focus is around helping organizations improve their performance, improve the environment, and, really focus on making their operations lower impact on the environment.
Because it's not just a maritime thing. This is a Paris Accord, and say what you want, and I don't want to get into the politics, especially around here in the U.S. But there are goals. People have goals. Companies have goals. Organization had goals. So it's not just the maritime, but it's the all walks of life, and all industries.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. And for me, I have a big problem with the perception of the maritime industry. The maritime industry, if you're stood next to a very old vessel and it's chugging away, and you see the pollution, you think it's incredibly bad. And yes, that pollution isn't good. But let's not kid ourselves. The footprint of a vessel is between 90 and 98% lower per ton shipped than flying it. So maritime is actually the solution by default. Even the maritime at its worst is better than aviation at its best. So for me, I think maritime is vital component of sustainability. And I think we get that wrong. And you mentioned earlier, Chris, politics. Let's just pick on a mobile. A mobile phone is what, $1,000? So if you have a sustainable solution to not need the mobile, you save $1,000 bottom line. So if you just think of something totally basic like telecoms in your team, get rid of the phone, the desk phone, the mobile, and put an app on their computer, on their laptop. They've got a headset and it behaves identically to a phone. It's better for the environment, better for your wallet. Not all sustainability is expensive. In fact, most of it saves money.
And not all of it is a radical change, because that wouldn't be radical. Going back to your point about maritime, I think you've become an honorary member of the maritime space by saying that we get a bad rap. I have to tell you, I saw a fantastic presentation in and about 2018. It was at my alma mater at Tunley Maritime, and they were doing a sustainability piece. And I remember the speaker, and I think it was a good gentleman by the name of Bob Kunkel. Bob's been in the industry for a long time, and he talked about the fuel consumption per ton of goods moved. And he didn't get into airplanes, right? He was talking, I think, around the ports of New York, New Jersey. He's saying, to move 1 ton of cargo, with 1 gallon, you could do, I think it was like 200 miles by truck, and it was like 400 miles by rail, but by tug and barge or by ship, it was 600-700 miles. It was exponentially greater. And it didn't even
Yeah.
take into account airlines. It was just a matter of, it was more about getting trucks and tractor trailers off of roads in and around New York City, because that's where the school's
I
based,
mean,
and reducing that, and that cost savings around not having to pave as much, not having to make as many pothole repairs, because you're not putting as many trucks on the road.
yeah. So the other thing, with trucks is when it's dry, there's loads of dust from them as well. So for me, I think, maritime is fundamental in the transition. And the idea that you could sort of change globalization and say, well, we don't need to ship stuff because we're going to make everything in one place, is based on the products that are manufactured, just not a reality. So I think that maritime has a huge role to play in supporting decarbonization globally. There's stuff that the maritime industry really can do, dockside power, but let's not say that's not without its problem, because if the dockside power comes from coal, that's worse than diesel.
Right.
So, or heavy fuel oil. So I think it's a very interesting point of conversation. And obviously from the accent, I'm from England, but every time I'm in the US, I find the moment I talk about financial prosperity in the maritime industry from decarbonisation, political opinions, they sort of fall away, and it's no longer a political opponent sustainability. It's just which makes business sense.
It just makes business sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that people, have to get their head around. Going back to airlines, one of the things, and I've talked about this before on my podcast, that came up recently, and to both myself and my guest, we were shocked that it actually happened to begin with. And that was that Apple was going to start shipping their iPhones on ships and not planes. It was shocking to me that they were putting them on planes in the first place. It was absolutely, I was stunned, because I always thought, airplanes were, let's say, for gold, artwork, transplants, organs, stuff like that. Like,
Well,
maybe a few other kind of these high-end electronics, maybe, but iPhones, I always thought it would be so
yeah.
natural to be, oh,
I
it
mean, for
goes on a
me,
ship.
the reality is the aviation sector, in itself also in some instances gets a bad rep, but perishable goods, they may not be able to cope with the lead time of maritime. So I don't think we need to collapse either industry. I just think we need to do them all better. But the fact is, if you've got a non-perishable good, moving it by boat makes sense. I would like to see the cost of shipping come down, because I know that cost of shipping, has gone up, but it's also gone up in the aviation sector. But I do think it's important to understand that maritime plays a vital role in decarbonising the economy.
It does. And I think you're right. I think you look at the potential for sustainable, not only from the environmental point of view, but from an economic point of view,
Yeah.
to make it sustainable, whether that's new industries are kicked off by it or what have you. One of the things that I want to talk to you about that's pretty interesting, and keeping on the theme of maritime, is, you guys are getting involved with some of the decarbonization around the port side, because we tend to think about the ships and kind of forget about the ports. I think there's a lot of focus, especially because ports, for a lot of people, and myself included, hand raised, it's a complex web of bureaucracy, of not sure who to talk to. As a ship, yes, there's layers of different paperwork. Eventually, you can find out that the technical manager or the head owner, you could eventually get to that.
Yeah.
Ports, I think, are even, I don't want to say as opaque, but certainly dealing with the B word, bureaucracy, makes it difficult. You guys are involved with some really interesting stuff in the port of Detroit. Also, a bunch of stipends the Biden administration just put out recently. We're recording this at the end of February. Recently, towards around the week of February 20th or 19th, there was a bunch of more money was funded, put out by the Biden administration. Talk to us a little bit about what you're doing.
So we're decarbonising the port of Detroit. One of the real challenges that you have with the maritime sector, if you think of the environmental footprint, is if you think about airports, generally speaking, airports, they're not smack bang in the middle of a city. When an airplane lands, its engines turn off. And the majority of the time when the airplane is emitting, it's 35,000 feet in the air. The challenge that we do have in the maritime sector is what I'd say more local pollution. So for example, if you think of things like sulfur dioxides, particle matter like PM 2.5 and these things, they are a problem in the shipping sector. And it is really wonderful to see that, the industry is putting a lot of effort into that, because remember, you have what's good for the environment and then the people that live next to it. And one of the challenges you have with ports is quite often communities have developed around the ports because they historically worked at the port. So it would make
And
sense.
commerce
Yeah,
would be at the port, whether even looking at,
yeah. And I
we're a
mean,
little
even if
newer than you, but look at New York. I mean,
yeah, I mean, if you look at a really interesting port in terms of its geography towards people, Detroit has a very spread terminals along the Detroit and River Rouge rivers, and there is communities there. And one of the challenges you are faced with is the amount of truck traffic you can then have through local communities. If you pick on another port, which we've not done work with, but we know of, the port of Miami, if you look at the real estate value immediately next to it, it is incredibly high. So one of the challenges ports have is you have a docked vessel that's sat polluting in many cases. And it's not just the emissions and the effect on global warming, it's the local effect on air quality. We've all been in a city, at some point jogging, and a polluting car's gone by and it's made us feel uncomfortable. So, that is damaging for health, and dependent upon the port, that can also be affecting marginalized minority areas of population in a really negative way as well. So there can be an economic disparity as a result of that. So I think there is definitely work to be done there, but at a global level, maritime is better per metric ton shipped from a carbon footprint perspective than aviation. There are different challenges we have with maritime. So, for example, vessels are noisy, and noise is often not good for wildlife, and particularly if you think of things like whales, for example, they can actually get disorientated from noise. So there is other environmental challenges that are not just carbon footprints, like biodiversity, for example. So we need to improve those things as well. Obviously, we don't want contaminated water being dumped back into lakes and into the ocean from when a vessel's got a lighter load. Definitely, on the whole, maritime is an industry that, if you ignore bureaucracy and politics, is supportive of decarbonization, really.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I find is that the ship owners, when you talk to them at the ship owning level, they are very much progressive and want to be ahead of the curve. And, I've had on somebody from the D'Amico family, and they said, Chris, if you look at all the things that happen, we've been doing this for years and years and years. When you look at the ESG regimen, and there are other people who say the same thing. Obviously, one of the challenges that shipping has to deal with, and it's similar to maybe the port infrastructure side, is that you don't you buy a car. I have a car that's 10 years old because I got a wife and 3 kids and we still need a minivan, but we're getting to the end of its useful life. If that was a ship, the ship would have gone for her second major dry dock and still got another 10, 12 years.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great point. And if we just talk about the car and the vessel perspective, the cost of a car is peanuts in comparison to the cost of a vessel. The lifespan, as you mentioned, of a vessel is definitely longer than that of a vehicle. What that tells me is you've got a few options. One is you retrofit the vehicle to a more sustainable propulsion system. That can be very costly, can be uncharted territory. You've got then different fuel supplies. Or the other is you change the fuel to a lower emitting fuel. There's also things you can put on to prevent pollution coming out the stacks, all sorts. And then there's the obvious stuff, which is retrofitting the vessels to dockside power so that when they're not moving, their engines are off. They're no longer idling. So there's a lot we can do there, but on really expensive capital assets or high value capital assets, I think it's important not to have a knee-jerk approach and to really focus on, how can we, because my aim is to turn people on to sustainability, not off. And a very easy way to turn people off is for it to sink their business economically by doing it. So we have to think better than that. And there is many grants available to support ports and ship operators and owners and vessel operators and owners with these things. There's electric tugs and stuff like that now that are coming out, and I think there's some grants. Don't quote me. I think there's some grant funding available for those as well. So it's a very, very interesting space. And one of the things I've been really impressed by, as we've got to know the industry more and been published in it and so on, is the innovation and the adaptability of really quite a lot of the operators is really wonderful. And for an industry that, because of how long a vessel lasts, you might think moved quite slowly, the attitudes are incredibly progressive, in my opinion. And I've seen some real forward thinking in that sense, some capitalization of the opportunities, really.
I had another guest on, Scott Bergeron from Oldendorf, and he said, Chris, we similar thing. We get a bad rap about not moving fast, but we actually have to consider that 25-year, 25-year timeline. And we also have to consider that the environment that we work in is more difficult than what the standard environment is for let's say other industry, right? Because you took a look at whether manufacturing or oil refining or things like that. That's where you would compare the scope of building a ship, especially more complex ones, and you have to be very careful about how you power them. Is this going to be a sustainable way of doing it in the future? And I think that that's something that, to your point, is that we have to consider. I just want to rewind a little bit back, talk about the port. So talk to us a little bit about what you're working on in Detroit, if you could say what you're kind of looking at. Because it's something that I haven't focused a ton on the podcast. And as I evolve as a podcaster, I'm like, I need to get more port people. So hint, if you're a port person, reach out to me. So I'm curious to hear what you have going on there.
We're working with the Detroit Wayne County Port Authority. Their executive director is called Mark Schrupp. And essentially, there's 18 terminals along the Detroit and River Rouge rivers. And we have, a very, very nearly at the end of developing a sort of net zero roadmap for each terminal. So we've determined their current carbon footprint for their terminal operation. So it doesn't include, if they've got a manufacturing plant there, it doesn't look at their process. It's looking at their dock operations, including onward, drayage, and also movement of goods in and around the terminal, and also to the highway. And for me, one of the wonderful things about this project has been the community engagement. We've done community events, also building relationships with the terminal operators, because one massive difference as an English company between England and the EU, or Great Britain, United Kingdom, and the EU versus the United States is information is generally more readily available in the UK and the EU. If we want to know the owner of a company, we can just find it in 2 or 3 minutes. Whereas in the US, private terminal operations, it's been really wonderful navigating, building a relationship with harder to enter businesses, and we've done it really successfully. And we've got a US employee, and Detroit has really helped us, really revolutionized our business. Actually, it's been a real blessing to us. Thank God for Detroit, we say. And that project has been wonderful in working out and supporting the terminal operators, find out their current footprint, defining where they can get to, both practically and economically speaking. And moving forward, we hope to support them with grant opportunities and so on in actually capitalizing on that. I think the main value of the, beyond the environmental value, is the development of working relationships, not just with us, but with each other, with those terminal operators, with the Port Authority. I think has gone really, really well. And that project's been led by my colleague, Dr. Robert Moorcroft, who's really done an outstanding job with that, along with the support of one of his team members, Emily. It's been really wonderful.
That's really great to hear. And it's always, especially when you look at a place like Detroit, and I know there's a lot of folks that, when you look at U.S. shipping, you think of Port of New York, New Jersey, you mentioned Miami for cruise ships, obviously Houston, you can't turn your back on that, Charleston, and on the West Coast and so on. People kind of lose track, is that's a heartland, Detroit. If you've ever been through there, I've driven through the port of Detroit, or alongside of it, as well as through to Toledo, which is kind of all connected on the Great Lakes. That is a massive part of our economy, even though we don't see that. Yeah. So that's really good. One of the things is that is also one of the kind of older, more entrenched parts of our industry. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you had to face when you went in?
Is
We could probably fill the podcast with that. I don't want to.
I
I don't
was
want to
I
be.
was going to say, how many podcasts are we going to do? So Mark Shrubston has been fantastic, and he's helped us, no end in developing this project and running it. And he's a real godsend for the Port Authority. One of the main challenges was identifying who do we speak to at these ports. If you think, oh, sustainability consultants, you think, well, they're going to go in, they're going to get data, they're going to crunch numbers, and they're going to give you the results. Well, that's part of it. One of the biggest challenges to us was getting in. We turned up at one terminal we were really struggling to engage with. I just put my scuffed, absolutely destroyed work boots on, walked on site. I said, I just need to speak to a manager, please. And within 2 days, we got the information we needed to do the work for them. Sustainability consultants, on the face of it, all nerds, all got doctorate. It's been totally different than what you would have envisaged. And, fortunately for us, yes, whilst everyone has a PhD, they're not the typical PhD candidate. It's been wonderful deploying skills that aren't just academic, building relationships, running community events. We've been involved with a partner helping us with community engagement there. It's been really wonderful. And I think for me, what's vitally important in that is being patient. I am not patient. I am a bulldozer, okay? I am stubborn to a core. But with these companies, it's no slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And it's building the relationship before you're asking for something.
Oh yeah.
And that has been really vital actually for this project to be successful at all. And I kid you not, there was times when we're like, how are we going to do this? And the bit we were struggling with wasn't the assessment. It was getting to the point where we could do that.
Right.
So one of the, certain things we've done, which is, for example, we've done the assessment, but no data is released until the whole project's finished. So that's been a really great way to reduce everyone's barriers. We've held Q&A sessions where we've invited all the terminal operators, bought far too many bagels and far too much coffee, got everyone together. What's very important is just meeting them and listening to the terminal operators. And instead of telling them, asking, what are your challenges and how is this impacting you? And what would you want to see from this sort of assessment?
Right.
Because
How would this
our assessment has not just looked at carbon footprint, it's looked at noise, vibration, and particulate matter.
Right.
So I think piecing it together and also explaining that this isn't to shut places down, this is to develop economic prosperity by, and I think there's a lot of divides over, climate change, and, there is people that think it's not real, and whether you do or don't, if one of our skill sets is propositioning these sorts of projects as it's good for business.
Yeah.
And I think when you start to do it like that, the barriers come down, the relationships start. But for us, the main lesson is steadfast patience. And that's been vital. And Mark's support with that has been absolutely amazing.
But I think one of the things that you bring up that is, I don't want to say it's unique to maritime, because I would think then, oh, come on, Chris, get off your horse. But certainly one of the things when you deal with anything, whether it's digitization or decarbonization in our industry, you're typically doing B2B. However, you need to have those. There are people on the other side, and you need to have those developed relationships over time that then could be useful, whether it was what I did for many years on the commercial side as a shipbroker, or even now being able to go into a client and listen to them and just hear, because I'm on the product side. It's certainly something that is a skill set that you cannot overlook. It's soft. It's not taught in schools. My schools, I don't have as many degrees, but I do have a couple, and they don't say, well, you got to figure out personal relationships. You kind of got to figure that on your own. Speaking of schools and getting into our industry, one of the things I love to, there's kind of two questions that I love to ask people. We'll get to the last one last, but this one here, when you talk to people outside the industry and they say, Dr. Beer, I'd like to come and work for you. And yeah, we have all these projects, but I'm going to put, I want to get into, I want to put you on maritime. What do you say to people to get them excited about maritime? Or if they ask you about, I'm doing my PhD in this and I'm going to focus on maritime, what do you tell them about our industry?
We always hear this thing, money makes the world go round. Maritime makes the world go round. Yeah, you look at what happened when the Suez Canal got blocked. Christmas trees were not delivered in time to Christmas in the UK. That was a real problem. So when you actually look at what is a strong, albeit very fragile industry, because it's so easy to explain the maritime industry, but so difficult when you get into the detail of how it operates. It makes just-in-time delivery in a manufacturing plant look easy. It is so complicated as an industry. And I think for me, the excitement in the maritime industry is just the opportunity. Whether it's, oh, it's an old industry. Okay, well, look at how tech is being deployed now. AI is being deployed to reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the emissions that vehicles, reduce the path that vessels are going, saving fuel, money, and reducing the footprint. So when you actually start to say, okay, well, what exists in here? One of Dr. Robert Moorcroft, his PhD, looked at reducing the friction of paints on vessels, so their footprint was lower when they went through the water. Yeah, and then that was to do with to reduce things growing
Drag,
on it.
right? It was to
Yeah,
drag, basically.
and you just think, well, that's just the paint. So if you think of that one thing, you could nerd out all your life on just the paint on a vessel.
Yeah, and now you start to look at like not only how slick it is, how long it'll last, but is it leaching chemicals into the environment that is negative? So you have to make it eco, that when it deteriorates, it doesn't do more damage.
Just think of the aviation sector, which is incredibly complicated as well. All the planes fly at slightly different altitudes. So when they're, arranging things to come in and out of airports or fly near each other over the Atlantic, they're at different altitudes. The altitude of the maritime industry is the same.
Right.
So just orchestrating the logistics. And also, it's not like as easy for a vessel to do a loop around the airport before it comes to dock, right? So I think for me, when you look at the complexities of it, yes, it's one of the first forms of transport that was ever commercialized, but its complexity is down to, if you just think of something like, I don't know, a steel mill, and how did all the bits of that steel mill really get there? You might see it on a truck, but how did it get on the truck? And that to me is what makes the maritime industry so exciting, is the fact that it is actually vital for food, vital for goods, and it does represent a light at the end of the tunnel for sustainability. There is more work to be done. We have to make ports lower footprint. We have to do stuff around some of the pollution they create that's not just a carbon footprint. And that is coming. But if you look at the tech space around maritime industry, it is pretty astounding, actually, what is there.
And it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek. I call this, obviously, the podcast The Last Dinosaur. We're one of the last ones to really fully embrace technology. I think I want to say the digital technology and transformation. There's a lot of other cool technologies going on. But one of the things that when I talk to people who are thinking about it, I'm like, there are so many things that you could do to impact our industry in a lot of ways. And I go back to a quote. I had a guest on last year, Kyle Henderson, of a company called Vision, and they do container tracking and things like that. And he said, Chris, said, if we make a 1% improvement on efficiency and people how to do their jobs, a 1% improvement of the container industry is a multi-billion-dollar cost savings, right? Yeah. So there are very few industries where you can make that, what looks like that little of a change or an improvement, and have that much of a knock-on effect, whether it's direct or indirect. It's a multi-billion-dollar thing that happens. Certainly coming from the outside, I appreciate your view, and you've been kind of like a champion for the maritime space, as well as we get into the digitization. One of the things that I love is just there's different opportunities. You don't have to have the background that I have, work on the ships, and yes, it helps in certain things, but there's a lot of different ways as well.
On the backgrounds, though, the one thing that PhDs all have in common is, in a PhD, there is a big problem, an academic problem, and your job when you do your PhD is to solve that problem. Now, irrespective of what industry you're in, there are problems in that industry. And what the PhD prowess gives us is the ability to start to solve complex problems. Right. Because A PhD is a degree in solving a problem. And that is a transferable skill when you break it down to that level. You might be the world's best at this tiny thing and think that means you're typecast or pigeonholed into that one thing, but it's just a problem.
Yeah.
And if you've solved that problem successfully, solving problems is a pretty good skill set to have.
I think what you'll find in the maritime space, and you hinted on it earlier, is that we are maybe don't have the degrees to say PhD, but there are a lot of people who just solve problems all day, whether it's,
Absolutely.
operational side, chartering, commercial side, environmental side, even trying to get, you know, a sick or a sailor that needs to get off a ship because of a home crisis. They are solving a problem, and it
Mm.
involves multiple different layers. From, let's say, you have a crew member that needs to get home off schedule, from the chaplaincy that'll help them out, to the operations, to the port authorities. It's kind of insane.
I've had the real luxury, Chris, of being a guest and keynote speaker at really quite a lot of conferences to do with the maritime sector, and I've met some wonderful people. And for me, I think one of the great things about the industry, which you don't have in many other industries, is there's a very strong sense of community in terms of we will all win or we will all fail together. And you just don't have that in other industrial landscapes where it's like, well, I can only win if someone in this room fails.
Right.
And I think, I've met with admirals at a conference last summer, met with tugboat owners. And for me, the one thing that's wonderful is everyone is just stoked about the industry. And I think the problem solving also comes down to a love for the industry. And that's really easy to see.
I wasn't there, but somebody told me, and the antidote is something like this. There was a meeting in Houston, and the Coast Guard captain of the port was there. This is a very, fairly, very senior person who, has a ton of responsibility from every, captain of the port, you're responsible for everything. And there was some, operations folks, and they said, listen, we really struggle because our shipments are delayed waiting for the Coast Guard to come on our ship. And we understand you have a manning problem, but we need to do commerce, right? And the story goes is that the admiral at the end of the discussion walked over to the people who asked and said, here is my personal cell phone number. If you have a problem, you need to call me and we'll figure it out. And I think it goes, you mentioned admirals, you mentioned, because he's enthusiastic, or she, I don't know if it was and obviously the chartering representative or the agents, whoever it was, need to do their job. They got to get ships in and out, and they all wanted to solve the problem. And I think that, like you said, maybe that is a little bit more unique than other industries for sure.
I remember at a conference last year, there was, I really wish I could remember his name now, but there was a business owner there who was guest presenting, and he ran a massive tugboat operation. And he said, I've got a video for you. And I kid you not, the theme song was a Motley Crue song. I was like, this guy is so passionate about this industry. And
Yeah.
there was drone flyovers of the tugs rescuing vessels and breaking ice. And I was like, yeah, I get it. I get the Motley Crue angle as the theme for that. I Kickstart My Heart by Motley Crue.
There we go.
And I was just thinking, yeah, I get it. And it's a tugboat. And he was so proud, actually, this tugboat captain, because they had, I think, the oldest tugboat on the Great Lakes. I kid you not, it was 1800s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The Great Lakes. Yeah.
I was like, amazing. And it's like generationally enthusiastic. I love it.
Amazing. There is so many different things. There's so many stories like that that we could obviously go on and on for. But as we wrap up here, one of the questions I like, and setting you up as a PhD a little bit. I've had several PhDs on the show, and I always find them to be great. No, that's all right. but like you said, they're all problem solvers. And so this question may be a little loaded the other way. So I always ask people what they're reading. And it was actually one of my first PhDs. He says, Chris, I'm not reading anything, I'm writing. Because that's what, some of the PhD stuff does. He actually was writing a book about fuel and things like that. Talk about, being granular. Dr. Viswa of Dr. Viz of Viswa Maritime. He was talking about writing a book. His passion is about making fuels more consistent. He used the airplane analogy. He said the amount of, kind of disparity in fuels, if we had that in airplanes and airplanes having the same issues, breaking down, whatever, the industry would be up in arms, but yet we let it happen. How can we make this a better, cleaner, safer part of our
Yeah.
industry? About very granular. So, what are you reading, or are you writing anything?
I've got a long list. I've got a long list in front of me. We are writing a book actually as a company. We're doing a book on sustainability, and I think I'm very fortunate, Chris. I can read a book in a couple of hours. I can speed read. I've got The Empire Builder. Okay, that's one. Hit refresh by the new CEO, or he's not that new, but the CEO of Microsoft. Now, for me, one thing that I think if you've got any listeners that are involved in business is vitally important is resilience. Okay.
Yeah.
So The Art of Resilience by Ross Edgley, an older book, which I actually got a couple of pages into and I thought, this is so old, I'm not reading it anymore. I'm not going to say the author of that one. Strategic Mindset. I've also got to nerd out and read a book on the complete guide of designing software. And for me, when I think of leading a business, I think your health is really important to that because
absolutely.
You mentioned the fuel. Well, what you eat is what you are. So we've also got the science of nutrition has snuck in there because if I'm healthy, my brain works better, and off we go. And my aim actually for this year is to read a book a week.
Well, yeah, I think you probably you've set the record, Will, as for the number of books talked about. I've gotten one or two, but not that many.
Sorry, I didn't show you that the last one is, it should appeal to the American audience as well. It's actually a workshop manual for an off-road car. So that's also in there. Well, I left that one just there. But yeah, so I think reading is, and also another one which is The Whispers Your Name as well. So I think, which my wife bought me. So I think reading is good. And the one thing I will say is the maritime industry could do more of. Okay, one thing we've noticed with maritime industry, it's quite a closed industry. And one of the things that my reading this really helps me with is seeing things in a total fresh light from a different industry perspective, which is applicable to my industry. And I think the maritime industry should study other industries a bit more and learn how can we deploy that method, that technique here. You mentioned the disparity in fuel. That's happening now, but why wasn't that being looked at 60 years ago?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I think the maritime industry could learn a lot from studying different industries and how those lessons and hard-fought lessons can be deployed in their sector without getting the scar that it got the original person.
It's funny you talk about the book that I just got done reading, and I took notes a little slower. How Big Things Get Done. I read it through the lens of exactly what you just talked about. And I'm actually I've been trying to do as part of my LinkedIn. I did like a quasi book review of a book I read a little while ago about creativity, because I'm not a creative person like in that way, but it was by Rick Rubin, the producer. Very interesting. And I'm going to kind of jot some notes down. And the reason why this is so interesting to me is that they say, well, first of all, if you ever say, somebody says this is a unique project, you got to ask yourself two things. If it's really unique, run away, because it's you're going to run into problems. And the other thing is it really unique? Can we draw on experiences, which is exactly what you're talking about, that we've done before or have before that we can apply to this? And I think that if you ask yourself that question, then you can end up in a much better place where you don't run into the pitfalls. And this talks about getting projects done, and it was think slow but act fast, which is a theme, which is a variation on the theme that you mentioned, which dealing with the folks in the Detroit River, thinking slow, slowing it down, making sure you have the right questions to ask. And they talk about a lot about looking at other industries. And even though it may not be a perfect fit, like, well, we've never done this before, but we know a lot of industries that have been very close. So even if you get it 80% right, you're going to be better, closer to not, running over than if you didn't think about that way. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah. So a great example I think of in that is if you look at like the pharmaceutical industry, the maritime industry could learn from. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most regulated industries in the world. So if you're in a maritime space and you're trying to get your head around regulation and governance, just study one that's incredibly difficult, and then your challenges are a load easier because you've seen the hardest fit and learnt the hardest fit. And I think that's why I've missed a book actually as well. Another one, pretty common one that's in there. So I think the maritime space can learn more from other industries. And that's no different than my industry. I can learn from the maritime industry. It goes both ways, and we
absolutely.
have. So, yeah, I think it's great.
Well, listen, Dr. Beer, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was enlightening to talk about your work with, Detroit, as well as the maritime industry as a whole, and your transition into that. Dr. Beer, thank you for coming on the podcast.
No, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.